All right, welcome. This is John, and I'm going to be doing this video on Peter Carroll's Tripod of Stokastikos, which is part of his chaos magic theory that he's written about in a number of books. So in this video, I wanted to give, first of all, some background on Peter Carroll and the CMT, some background on chaos and complexity, and then we'll get into the tripod itself. And so in talking about the tripod, it will basically review a few different math equations that Peter provides in his books, and those are listed below here. That might look complicated, but the point of this is to graph them out with the tripod of Stokastikos and get an intuition for nonlinearity and see what lessons we can extract from this for magical practice. So let's get into it. Okay, so chaos magic. This sounds kind of, ridiculous. It sounds kind of absurd. It's for the type of people who want to do rituals to see if they can influence what's happening with astronauts and stuff. It's very, very questionable at times, but I think that it's the most interesting branch of esoteric thought that's around right now because it doesn't take itself too seriously. It's about results. So Peter's written about this in books like Liber Chaos or the Octavo. The Octavo is probably the best thing. It's the most in-depth. Liber Chaos, I think, gives you a bit of a better introduction. And there's also a free blog post if you don't want to buy the books called Chaos Magic in a Nutshell. And the link is right here. I'll put it in the description as well. And so he gets into just the basics of, spell casting basically, and he puts it into some formalized equations, which I think is fascinating. So when I talk about chaos magic, though, basically what I mean is the strategic use of nonlinear dynamics and highly interactive systems for favorable probability manipulation. That's kind of a mouthful, and I'll break down what I mean by that. But throughout this video, the questions I would ask yourself are basically, what does this mean, and how should it inform your practice? So let's talk about chaos and complexity. So first of all, if you want a much better explanation of complexity or chaos dynamics, there are plenty of people who are more equipped to talk about this than myself on YouTube. One of them is Melanie Mitchell, who does a fantastic series on Complexity Explorer, which is affiliated, I believe, with the Santa Fe Institute. And so, I would check that out. She talks about entropy. She talks about chaos, about nonlinearity, all this type of stuff. And, I'm talking about this in terms of magic, which she doesn't because she's reasonable. But I would, give that a little viewing if you want. It has quite a bit of stuff in it. So first of all, what is chaos? When the term chaos theory came out, and when Jurassic Park is mentioning it with Jeff Goldblum and all that, it became this whole thing. And chaos theory sounds really cool, but let's get away from the sort of glorified notion of this, and let's break it down to a definition. So chaos in this case, it's relatively, it's part of this whole world of dynamical systems and complexity systems, complexity science, nonlinear dynamics. And so in this case, chaos refers to extreme sensitivity to initial conditions. So this is, what's popularly known as the butterfly effect. So, of course, when this idea came about, people were basically trying to weaponize this. How can we use the butterfly effect, this catchy thing that's part of chaos theory? How can we use it, to make money or to have a more powerful military or whatever? But the idea here is that, you can have some small effect at the beginning with your initial conditions, and that will cause a system to play out completely differently. So, when we talk about complexity, then this is referring to those nonlinear dynamics. So when you have enough subcomponents or subagents in a system and they begin to interact, and it creates this effect where you might not be able to easily predict the causality of it. And so I would definitely suggest also looking into the Cynefin framework, which I did a quick little video spiel about, where it breaks down the difference between chaos, complexity, complicatedness, and simplicity. And so, check that out. I think that's a great model to have for thinking about these types of systems. But when Peter Carroll is using this, he's trying to use this as a way to make these esoteric ideas like, manifesting or whatever. He's trying to put it into a more scientific lens, and he still does it, calling himself, like the Stokastikos mage or something like that. So he obviously has a poetic, silly way of going about it that's, very informed by Pratchett and such. So anyway, what we're going to be doing basically with the tripod itself is plotting the magical landscape. And so we're just going to have a function, which is his spell casting equation. And that's going to give us this landscape when we graph it in a 3D space, and it can give us a nice intuition. So the tripod of Stokastikos is basically just a heuristic model that has some implications for the magical practitioner's target selection. So we're going to be talking about a few variables here, and a variable, or an output basically that comes out of those variable inputs. So when I'm talking about magic here, I will be using his variable psi. He also uses m sometimes, just because, getting the psi variable here is kind of a pain in the ass. Still haven't been able to find the keyboard shortcut for it. Let me know in the comments if you know what it is. So psi is basically your magical potency. And then our next variable is going to be p, which is the probability of an event happening by natural chance. Okay, so these are both going to be measured between 0 and 1. And when I say between 0 and 1, I mean as basically like a floating point where, it can be a decimal number that could be 0.000000001. It honestly won't really ever be 0 or 1. It will be some sort of, number that's between that as a decimal. And the resulting number that we get, that we will be plotting on the z-axis, is going to be p given psi, or basically the probability of an event happening given the application of the practitioner's magic. Okay, so this is what this tripod looks like, basically. And this, I pulled this directly from his article, Chaos Magic in a Nutshell. So again, P here, which is the long sort of side on the base here, where it says 1 to 0. That means that, if we're all the way on the far left with a probability of 1, that means something is certain to happen. If we're on the right over here with the 0, it's going to say that it's almost completely not going to happen, or there's like no likelihood of it happening. And then if you look at the axis that's orthogonal to that, it's going to be psi, which is on a scale of 0 to 1. 1 essentially means you are you are king among sorcerers, and 0 means you haven't applied any magic whatsoever. Now, we get this kind of cool curvy little landscape that comes down, and that is because our function will give us the p given psi. So basically you can see here that it's not a linear function. It's not straightforward. You don't want to necessarily use every bit of possible magic for any given instance. There are going to be diminishing returns. There's a sort of marginality of the utility of using different combinations of natural odds with your magical, application. So this is basically the nonlinearity that arises from the function. So the function that we're talking about is this, and this isn't the most beautiful way to write it out. I'm not great at writing out things in mathematical notation on Google presentation, but this is his spell equation. He also provides the anti-spell equation. So basically, you're either trying to make something happen or trying to make something not happen. I'm going to focus on trying to make something happen. So again, the variables are between 0.0 and 1.0. And I should note that, again, 0 and 1 aren't probabilities. And this is something that, my guy Eliezer Yudkowsky talks about. So there are implications here for realism and also for sort of the impossible. So we'll talk about that more as we get into the video. But I want you to think of psi as basically like an amplitude and p as a power law distribution. So you could think of it as a Gaussian distribution, but I think that in most cases that we're talking about a power law distribution or a fat-tailed distribution or one of these is going to be more effective. Okay, so the 0.0, if you see 0.0 written here in one of the spreadsheet snapshots that I provide later, it very well might be a truncated number. It might actually be 0 point and then like a ton of zeros and then 3, 1 or something like that. So just assume that 0 and 1 are kind of theoretical and we don't ever necessarily hit those because, in some sense, you're always applying a bit of magic. And if you were able to get a magical sort of, potency or like a psi level of 1, then you'd be able to achieve anything. And that, like, let's be honest, you aren't going to be able to teleport a planet, but in Liber Chaos, I believe it is, Peter Carroll has an interesting way of talking about this where, like, if you wanted to teleport a planet, you would just have to have a psi measure of 1.0, which is pretty much not going to happen. And we'll see that's because psi is actually it's not an easy thing to measure because it's a made up thing, but we are going to break it down into 4 separate variables, and it's very hard to even get a psi level of 0.5. So this is because basically when you have these different variables that make up the psi component, of which he has 4, it's going to be, again, a set of numbers that are all between 0 and 1. And when you multiply them together, basically very quickly will reduce the number to something very small. And it's, basically this is one of those things where there's sensitivity to the system's behavior, or what am I saying here? So I said, due to the sensitivity of a system's behavior, it's helpful to probe with a heuristic model such as the tripod of Stokastikos. So this is just a nice way to plot it out using this model, because you might not get a feel, like a visceral feeling for what any of these equations mean unless you actually sort of go in there and fiddle around and see how it behaves. So it's good to probe and see what the behavior is like, because that's the point of this, is to get some sort of lesson that we can extract. Okay, so the lesson here, or the spell equation here is the probability given psi equals p plus 1 minus p times psi raised to the 1 over p power. Okay, so that is spelled out a lot more nicely when you look at his writing, where it's in a more sort of standard mathematical notation. But basically, the threshold for psi being useful whatsoever is around 50%, 0.5. And again, this is going to be pretty hard to get, actually. So don't think, oh, I'm so magical, I can do anything. It's like, no, your magic probably sucks. It's probably not 0.5. So then we'll see that one of the lessons is that a psi level of about 80% for events that are about 80% likely to happen, that's a good sweet spot for beginners, because it's a sort of plausible level of magic that's going to probably just really help that thing that's already decently likely to happen to actually definitely happen. And when I say definitely, I mean that in a loose sense. I don't mean 100% certainty, but we'll also see that there are diminishing returns as p and psi both approach 1. Okay, and then there's also the flip side of that, which is that there's the realm of the impossible as p approaches 0 and psi approaches 1.0. Okay, so this is my version of the tripod. I just wanted to sort of get in there and make a visualization of it myself. And you know what? I like it better than Carroll's. So it has some color. It's got the axes on there. And so think of this as like a landscape, and again, the threshold for psi is going to be around 0.5. And so in this case, the psi is going to be the y-axis, and the x is going to be p. And so you can see there's this big steep increase over here. And this is basically, to get something to happen that's completely unlikely, you're going to have to climb up this very steep hill. Okay, so as I said, psi is going to break down into a few subcomponents, and he uses 4 here, 4 variables basically, and it's just a hypothetical measure for psi. And again, this isn't like a pure, like this isn't like a proven equation or anything. This isn't real math. This is just a nice model to wrap your head around some stuff about how nonlinearity works and how complex systems work. So he breaks it down into psi equals G times L times B times S, where G is Gnosis, L is the magical link, B is your belief, and S is subliminalization. I like to rename these a little bit because depending on which piece of his you read, he might frame these as sort of the flip side component, like subliminalization might be how receptive are you to something, or these things where he's going to put it in the equation as 1 minus this to get you the flip side of the probability. Like, if your subliminalization is 0.4, then 60% is that it's very clearly in your rational mind. So I'm just using all positive variables here because I don't think that's any easier to use the 1 minus the variable type thing that he did. So first of all, we should note that the product of these variables, so when you multiply them all together, it has to be less than or equal to 1.0. You can't get magic that is over 1. So again, the modest level of a psi equaling 0.5 is pretty difficult to get. And so, like, let's say we have each of these variables at 0.5. Even let's just say we have 2 variables both at 0.5. That's going to get you to 0.25 immediately. So you do that again, and 3 variables all at 0.5, and that gets you to basically 0.125. So very rapidly, if you don't have all the components of your system dialed in, it's going to sort of reduce it to the product. It's not about the sum, it's about the product. So another interesting thing to note here is that being multiplicative and not additive, any sort of group effort is still calculated as a product rather than a sum. So if you are like, well, I'll get all my friends who are all into magic and we'll all collaborate on this thing, it's still going to be calculated as one person. And the way that he describes this is having that large group of people isn't necessarily actually that beneficial for getting a high level of psi. It's just maybe you will get a broader range of crazy ideas that will allow you to, conceive of some sort of way of getting a higher psi level, but it's not actually useful to have that many people collaborating. And I think that this has some implications for your collaboration that I'll talk about towards the end. But let's talk a little bit about his ingredients. So again, the point is that you integrate these into your magical potency. And while he has his 4 ingredients, I would say that it doesn't really matter how many ingredients you have. It just matters that they are integrated and that you have a combination of them that are integrated to create a complex system. And complex systems are super interesting, super powerful, but they don't have clear causality. And so learning how to manage that is kind of what the magic is about here. So first of all, Gnosis. This is basically being used to mean something like an altered state. I know that the word Gnosis has a whole history behind it, and I'm not here to be, Mr. Authenticity. I'm not really interested in the word Gnosis as it pertains to the Gnostics or whatever. But basically, this is getting out of yourself. This is sort of transgressing. This is, again, it's 0 to 1, but it's going to be kind of an ambiguous measure. Is it about the quality of your gnosis? Is it about the intensity? Is intensity, high intensity gnosis, is that necessarily quality gnosis? Is it that you have greater exoticism of your gnosis? Hard to say, but essentially the effectiveness of your gnosis is going to be measured on a 0 to 1 scale. And then next is the magical link. And as I understand it, this is basically your internal simulation of the event in question and how high is the resolution. So, can you clearly visualize exactly what you're hoping to target? So basically, to magically move mountains, as it were, you would have to have a very high resolution mental image of moving mountains. And so, if you indeed have the perfect magical image in your mind of how to move mountains, maybe you could, but moving mountains, that's it's not going to happen. So don't try to teleport planets, but realize that the implication here is that you need to really have a fine-grained, high-resolution magical link that will show you what you are trying to target and how you're getting it. Next, belief. This is probably my favorite one to think about because it lets me sort of start name dropping bays and talk about epistemology and that type of thing. So basically, the chaos magic theory states that belief is used as a technology. There's this whole idea that nothing is true and everything is permitted. But basically, having no credence leaves you in this void where nothing is true, and that means you don't get to benefit from any truth or supposed truth. So, select the belief that you want to have a credence in. And generally speaking, I don't think that maybe it's an information hazard to go around promoting people selecting their own credences. I would say, dial in your epistemics and refine them and always update. But at the same time, belief is a technology, and so do what you will with that. But of course, be careful. So some interesting things I'd mention here are, basically sharpening your forecasting by making beliefs pay rent. So, look into things like Metaculus or various prediction markets, or basically just put odds on things more frequently. If somebody asks you, is this going to happen? Think about it as a percentage, because simply putting the number on it is pretty helpful. And it will sharpen up your epistemics over time. And of course, be willing to update. Now, again, for the nth time, I'm going to remind you that 0 and 1 aren't probabilities. So basically saying I'm 100% sure that it will happen is profound anti-magic. And even saying, the sort of colloquial use of the word, of saying, 100% in response to something, that's it's almost a psyop. Like, don't say 100% because it's not a probability. Okay, next, subliminalization. This is a mouthful, as you just heard me stumble over it. But basically, this is how effectively you bypass your frontal mind, your sort of rational, system 2, as Kahneman would describe it. And this has to do with your receptivity. Is that receptivity? I don't know. It has to do with how open you are to this. So if you bypass system 2 and just go to system 1, it can do a ton of the heavy lifting for you. Okay, so now potential space. Basically, if we think about things in terms, like if we think about this function in terms of the amount of magic that went into it, sort of like an investment, we can think about the potential that we could get out of it. And so, you see all these zeros here. These aren't actually zeros. They're very close to 0. They've been truncated for the sake of this graph looking nicer. Now, as you can see, when our magic level approaches 1 and this color goes to yellow, the realm of potential and possibility is, extremely high. And this should be taken in a sort of poetic way where you don't think, you're going to be able to move the mountain or teleport the planet or whatever, but we're going to want to use that high level of magical potency selectively because it's not really possible to achieve regularly. And so we can also see that pretty much everything here is 0. Eventually you get like a 0.1 or, then we sort of get to the sweet spot. And I'd say the sweet spot isn't the darkest yellow. It's kind of here in the middle where you're starting to get like, 2 or 3 or 2.3, 3.6. So again, the sweet spot for most people who aren't like the number one sorcerer in the world, is going to be kind of like 70 to 80% on both natural odds and magical, potency or psi. So basically, most of the situations that are, most of the situations you're going to be in are going to do better with just mundane techniques. And it's kind of funny because Carroll says basically like, make sure also to do all the mundane things that you would that aren't magical at all, because otherwise you're asking your subconscious to sort of make them not happen. And so at the end of the day, he's kind of like, he's talking about magic, but he's saying, make sure to do everything that isn't magical too. So it's like, make sure to just make the thing happen by normal means. And it's a sort of a nuanced way of saying that magic isn't real, but that it's helpful. Okay, so some other stuff that I'll end with here that I think is interesting and related, that is decidedly non-esoteric. So first of all is Bayes everything. This might be Bayes' theorem, Bayesian inference, the Bayesian brain, Bayesian statistics, Bayes nets, etc. This all has to do with conditional probabilities. And so, when we do conditional probabilities, we multiply probabilities by probabilities, and it helps you get a sense, like if you see somebody that looks this way, who has glasses and is carrying a bunch of books coming from the library, are you assuming that they are a business major, or are you assuming that they are a library sciences major? And most people will say, oh, well, glasses, they're probably a librarian or like librarian, whatever. But it doesn't take into account the vast difference in how many business majors most schools have versus library science majors. So, at the end of the day, it's more likely that it's going to be a business major, and that we just have a bias that made us make the wrong guess. So this type of way of sharpening up how you think about things is, I think, extremely potent. And if you want to learn about this, go to Less Wrong, or read Astral Codex 10 or Slate Star Codex, that type of stuff, where they talk about this. Or Sean Carroll always talks about being good Bayesians. Sean Carroll, not Peter Carroll. But next is IIT, or Integrated Information Theory. This is something that's popularized by Giulio Tononi, and basically he talks about consciousness as phi instead of psi here. So sort of has some similarities, but basically the idea is that maybe a thermostat is to some degree conscious, but the degree of information that is integrated is such that it's negligible, but it's still non-zero. While humans have this fancy self-reflective, huge combination of, all these different dimensions in how it's going about everything. And so that gives us the sort of magical feeling of consciousness where it's essentially just an incredible amount of information that has been processed and integrated. Of course, Scott Aronson wrote a blog post that famously refutes this idea. That's worth checking out. But nevertheless, Tononi and Christoph Koch, they both have pushed this idea forward, and it's been hugely influential in the philosophy of mind world. So worth looking into. Next is just generally physics and quantum mechanics. Peter Carroll always says basically divine short and enchant long. And that has to do with the arrow of time and the probabilistic nature of quantum mechanics. And so that's also interesting to look into, or, looking into sort of discrete and continuous time and phenomenal time. And this roughly relates to Peter Carroll's idea of like shadow time or pseudo time. And so he's saying that there are other dimensions of time that you can draw from to basically make probabilities work in your favor. Next is cellular automata. This is like the idea sort of from the Game of Life, or from Stephen Wolfram's cellular automata, like whatever his book is, a new model for science. So there's this specific region called the region of life, where you can have these simple rules that generate these sort of almost lifelike little animations of like gliders. And it's interesting when you have this system where you combine a bunch of small rules, or not even a bunch of small rules, just some small rules, some simple rules, and the yield is such that you almost create digital life. Like it almost looks lifelike because of the interaction of the parts. And so that's what we're going for, basically. We aren't going for a very complicated system that has a ton of parts that don't actually have any synergy. We're looking for something where there's this small region where suddenly something emerges and is extra potent and extra interesting. And like humanity is interesting, and like what's the likelihood that we exist? So you want to make a system that almost has a sort of biological feel to it in the way that the complex dynamics work out. Another way to get a good intuition for this I mentioned earlier is the Cynefin framework. Dave Snowden came up with this idea. It's popular in various management circles, and so it distinguishes between simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic, and sort of the way that you need to classify these systems. So that's a great framework to look into. I have a video on it that's relatively short. And then the last two are basically relationships and collaboration. So if you're collaborating, if you have a band or something like that, you want to make sure that you aren't at each other's throats. You aren't basically multiplying in a way that reduces your capacity. You want to have synergy. You need that integrated synergy to make anything work. And so, this is kind of interesting when we go back to the idea that, Carroll says where just because you have two people, it doesn't mean that you can exceed a magic level of one. You still have to have the product versus the sum. And so, this goes for relationships too. And it's interesting. Just remember that it's about the product, not the sum. Now, lastly, I'll say economics and sort of marginal utility functions. At the end of the day, we're talking sort of about a utility function, and having a clear idea of that is kind of like the magical link in many ways. But to have a good understanding and intuition for the way that you get marginal returns or diminishing returns and all that, at the end of the day, this is kind of an economics problem almost. So most people don't want to talk about economics. They're into esoteric shit because it sounds like, ooh, that's the man. But like economics is a pretty outstanding soft science. So take what you can from it. As Gordon White would say, we're here for the tech. So take the tech and don't worry about taking on the lifestyle of an economist. Just take the tools that they use and apply them. All right, so that's it. That was basically the tripod Stokastikos and some equations from Peter Carroll for magic, spellcasting, and getting a heuristic measure for psi. And so if you want to support more content like this, first of all, please subscribe, leave a comment, hit that thumbs up, as they say. And if you want to financially support this and the Podcast Bridge podcast or anything like that, head over to patreon.com/Lambertronics. All the support that you provide is very much appreciated. So thanks for watching. I'll talk to you in the next video. 33 minutes? Damn. Was I too all over the place? You should have. I don't care.